Good afternoon, everyone. Well, good afternoon for me in The Hague, at least. Other times are available to others. Welcome. My name is Dennis Poeders. I am a professor of global security and technology at Leiden University, working at the campus of The Hague. And one of the programs we run here at the Institute is the Hague program on international cybersecurity. And that's a program that we run a monthly seminar series under. We do different things under the seminar series, but mostly we look at new books that are out or are about to come out on different topics that relate to sort of the broad church of international cybersecurity. Today, we're going to be talking about a book that is to be published, if I'm correct, is coming out in June. Called Elements of Deterrence, Strategy, Technology, and Complexity in Global Politics. And we're joined by both the authors, both Erik Gartzke and Jon Lindsay are here. Erik is a professor of political science and the director of the Center for Peace and Security Studies at the University of California, San Diego. And Jon is an associate professor at the School of Cybersecurity and Privacy and the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Welcome both. We're going to be talking about your book. Well, initially you will be talking mostly about your book, and then we'll have a discussion with those online and who have questions for you. Obviously, we looked at the blurb on the website of OUP, Oxford University Press, that it will publish, and one of the questions that was on there, sort of in your description, was a question I like very much: is how much can we expect of deterrence, right? So this theory that was developed very specifically during the Cold War, focused on nuclear deterrence, has been stretched and mangled and trying to be elaborated on and connected to different new technologies. And that is, I think, very much what you're trying to do in the book. It's not the first time you have looked into this. This is one of the others that's come out of your long-standing cooperation on this, cross-domain deterrence from 2019. So I'm looking really forward to your presentation, and I hope we will have a fruitful discussion afterwards. Jon has advised me that he may have to skip out a little early because of picking up children from school or daycare. He's obviously excused. Erik will be here to hold the fort, as we always do. We have an hour for this, so at the hour we stop, unless we are fully satisfied before that moment. I now hand over to Jon and Erik for their presentation.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Dennis. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think the way we'll do this, I'll do the presentation. We'll try and wrap that up pretty quickly so that we can get into the fun part of conversation. Got a couple of slides here. Hopefully everybody can see that. And Dennis is absolutely right. This is the second book in this collaboration. This is a kind of a decade-long research project that's been going on, originally funded by the U.S. Department of Defense Minerva Initiative. And this started back when Michael Nacht, who was just coming off some time in the Obama administration, where he was managing nuclear forces, ballistic missiles, space and cyber forces, and he was really concerned about cross-domain deterrence. So we started looking at it under that rubric. And that first book was an edited volume where we really brought together lots of great colleagues in different areas and kind of said, cross-domain deterrence, discuss. What do you think this is? And in that book, we really didn't provide our opinion, and partly we were still forming that opinion. But this book then is kind of cashing that check that we wrote in the first book, kind of circling back and trying to put together a more integrated statement that we had published in part in a lot of different areas. The original idea of this book was that we would take some of those papers, give them kind of a light gloss, and staple them together, and that would be a book. And it turned out to be a much more thorough kind of revising effort with a lot of new material. So this really is kind of an overview picture of what we're thinking about in terms of what used to be called cross-domain deterrence, and you know, fashions in the defense world being what they are, that term has moved on. The term of art is now integrated deterrence, but it's still kind of the same idea of bringing lots of things together and thinking through those complexities. Okay, so first off, what about that crazy cover? So, you know, why do we have a picture of the Earth and this Death Star in front of it? And what that actually is a picture of the Earth from the Discover satellite, the Deep Space Climate Observatory, which hangs out at this Lagrange point between the Earth and the Sun. And it provides these amazing pictures of the Earth. In this case, right, the backside of the moon, not really the dark side. It's actually illuminated. And we like this for a couple reasons, right? This is kind of showing us something we're very familiar with, the Earth, but we're looking at it from a different perspective. And that's what we're trying to do with deterrence, right? I mean, do we really need another book about deterrence? Don't we understand deterrence really well? And our argument is that actually new technologies are forcing us to revisit deterrence and recognize that there are complexities that have always been there, that were there in the nuclear area, that were there with Herodotus, but haven't really been surfaced. And these new technologies really kind of make deterrence due for a revisit. We also like it because you know, space and cyber were kind of the provocations that really got the Pentagon and got us thinking about this as well. You know, Erik and I first started working together on cyber, kind of on the skeptical side, and we really kind of quickly, you know, converged to this perspective that cyber is really interesting when you start considering its interaction with other domains. And so, you know, deterrence, I think, falls naturally from that. Okay. So just as an intuition pump, I want to kind of consider this case. We're all very familiar with it. The Maginot Line is kind of the byword of failed strategic technology, right? In its day, right, it has these amazing technological creations, right? You can see the piece of artillery popping out of the ground there. Lots and lots of investment, cutting edge technology for its day. And obviously, World War II happens. Okay, so, you know, this is sort of the byword of strategic failure. And I guess we'd like to ask, is this really a deterrence failure, right? In fact, we might want to ask, is it possible to view the Maginot Line as deterrent success, right? If you look at the German breakthrough there in 1940, none of it touches the Maginot Line, right? This is a terrifically successful instance of deterrence by denial. The French said, don't go in this area. And the Germans said, we won't go in that area. We'll go somewhere else. Okay, so yeah, it's a deterrence failure if you don't want the Germans to do anything. But one of the arguments that we develop in this book is that in deterrence, you don't get to keep the other side from attacking or aggressing or behaving. You do get to decide how you are going to interact. So deterrence is more about shaping behavior than preventing it. And that's a slightly different spin on things than the nuclear area, where we had to prevent World War III. That would have been utterly disastrous. Okay. The weapons are so big, so powerful, so ghastly, right, that any use is tantamount to failure. So there's really a focus on preventing war altogether. But when you look at how deterrence works in history, in fact, even in the Cold War, it looks a lot more like this, right? It looks like deterrence policies put together with a particular set of expectations, and then political competition continuing on nonetheless. Oops. Okay, so let me we can tell a similar story in the cyber domain, and this is the very recent, hot off the presses, Five Eyes advisory about SVR, right? Kind of Russian KGB outgrowth. This is the same actor that was involved in SolarWinds, that is continuing to evolve. And the report basically says, since SolarWinds, organizations have gotten a lot better at securing their on-premise software systems and even software supply chains. So hacking your local software code base is a little bit more difficult, but SVR has figured out how to get into cloud-based services by accessing administrative and dormant accounts that have lots and lots of access. Okay, so very familiar kind of counter move story in cybersecurity. SolarWinds itself was surprising, right? Because lots of companies thought that they were doing cybersecurity right by having kind of this Orion network management system patch all of their systems, and yet they were smuggling in this Russian backdoor in the process. Okay, so, this is another kind of Maginot Line kind of case where you have effective defenses that are, not just working, but actually discouraging aggression in one area, and yet channeling it into another direction. Now, this is particularly relevant for cyber because, everybody knows that deterrence is not a useful strategy in cyberspace. Right, so U.S. Cyber Command came up with this story of persistent engagement and defending forward, and the idea was that you can't use deterrence in cyberspace. You need to be proactively out defending and shaping the domain. Right, and that may be right or wrong, but that's kind of the story. But I think what we'd like to point out is that when you actually think about it from a threat actor's perspective, especially SVR, right? This is a highly skilled actor that takes a lot of effort to ensure that they are having stealth, that they are difficult to detect, that they are obfuscated, right? What does that mean? It means they are concerned about the consequences, right? It means that they are modifying their behavior because they're worried about what compromise might look like, what retaliation perhaps might look like, certainly what the loss of capabilities might look like, right? So there's another way of saying that it's not that deterrence is relevant in the cyber domain. In fact, it profoundly shapes the reason for engaging in secret obfuscated operations in the first place. Okay. One more kind of story just to kind of, again, get us going. I think we'll probably be talking about this case a lot more in the Q&A since, deterrence is so important with the current war in Ukraine. But, when we were writing this book, the war hadn't quite started yet, but there was kind of a lot of worry about kind of gray zone conflict, right? And gray zone was looked at as kind of deterrence failure. And we kind of turned it on its head and said, well, yeah, there's something happening. That's deterrence failure. But you're actually seeing kind of this very interesting sensitivity of Russian aggression in Europe to what we would call as a gradient of deterrence, right? So, Estonia, NATO member, right? You want to kind of be careful, right? We see cyber operations. Georgia, right? Not a NATO member, deeper in kind of the Russian sphere of influence. Russia can act pretty confidently knowing there's not going to be a problem. 2014, right? A little more circumspect, our little green men, cyber attacks, right? And so you see this. And then the question is, well, what the heck happened between, that kind of nice pattern in 2014 and then this breakout in 2022? And the interesting thing here is that we have an actor that in 2014 basically said, I'm going to take my second best option, right? Like I'm going to do this subversion gray zone stuff, not necessarily because I think it's effective, but because the alternatives are really, really distasteful. I don't want to start a big war, but I also don't want to abandon the field. Well, you let that run on for 7 years, right? And you have lots and lots of Western intervention and improvements in Ukraine's ability to resist gray zone activity. And now Russia finds out that its second best option is now its third or fourth best, right? Like, it now has to say, like, am I just going to tolerate this situation? And if the answer is no, right, then it can decide to escalate. Now, it hasn't escalated all the way, right? There's still kind of like, it could get worse. It could spill outside the borders, right? There's the nuclear threshold. So we're still looking at a conflict that is contained by kind of the implicit risks of going to a higher level vertically or horizontally. So all of these are kind of just ways of saying that, like, deterrence is part of this ongoing game of rock, paper, scissors, where you are shaping the behavior of both adversaries and potential allies.
Yeah, John.
Okay. Yes.
Just on the last slide,
Yeah.
I think the way I would like to frame it is that the Ukrainians got 8 years to prepare for an invasion instead of not getting 8 years to prepare for an invasion. And pretty much everybody who's been watching this thinks that it made a difference. We want language that would allow us to describe that consequence, that effect. And we can call deterrence in this case a failure, but it gave them 8 years of time. And that was a terrifically valuable thing that probably changed, at least in the short term, the way in which the war sort of evolved once it began. So we're also thinking about this notion about deterrence by degrees, in which you may not get everything you want, but you get something you want out of deterrence. And in most settings, we want to be able to talk about things that aren't precisely perfect, but we'd still consider a partial success. So,
Great. Thank you, Erik. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much time on the rest of this, but I do want to give you a flavor of kind of the actual argument of the book. I kind of know that we've got several political scientists that are in the room here, and people who are at least kind of have a passing familiarity with the bargaining model of war. And either explicitly or implicitly, this is really a workhorse in the way that we think about things, right? So Fearon 1995 is kind of the famous version of this, but it shows up in lots of other places. And just the core insight is that war is costly, right? It's the outside option. It's like the failure in a it's like a labor strike, right? That's bad for both capital and for the strikers. But they do it anyway in order to try and signal how much they care, because that's really the question, right? So there's this bargaining process that goes on. War is a bargaining process, right? War is costly. You're only going to see it if you have incentives to misrepresent. People are bluffing. People don't understand the true balance of power. They can't commit to things in the future. So hopefully that's basically familiar to everyone. We want to kind of just observe that when you look at the very basic bargaining model, there really are only four models that matter, right? What you are asking for, right? Your military power in case, negotiation fails and you find yourself on the battlefield, so your ability to win a war. How much that war is going to cost. And we would also say how much the bargaining process in peacetime or crisis might cost. And then there's uncertainty about everything, right? So those are really the four things that matter. And the bargaining model just says, get more, maximize utility. Well, how do you actually do that? Should I do that by moderating my demands? Should I do that by increasing my military capabilities? Should I do that by finding a less expensive way to fight or to bargain? Should I do that by clarifying everything for everybody, right? All of these things may help me to get more, but how should I do it, right? And this is an economic model, right? And it just says, well, hey, here are some parameters. What those parameters are and which one you care about, that's exogenous to the model, right? So we want to point out that there actually are political preferences that nations, that organizations, that individuals might care about, right? You need to have a story of preference formation, okay? But do you care more about influencing the status quo? Do you care about winning the war? Do you care about doing it on the cheap, right? Do you want to ensure that there's not a war, right? When we talk about deterrence, or when policymakers talk about deterrence, they kind of talk about all these things, right? I want Russia to do what we want if the if deterrence fails, we want to win against the war, and we want the Russians to know it. We would like to do it without breaking the bank, right? Let's kind of keep our spending below 2% and still kind of keep deterrence going. Let's not have a big nuclear war, right? All of those things are part of deterrence, but it's hard to have them all at the same time, right? And we argue that in the rubric of deterrence, there are actually these 4 different strategies that are maximizing or minimizing these different parameters, right? And then the next part, if we have multiple ends in deterrence, we also have multiple means. And those different means are actually specialized, or they tend to be more suited for pursuing these different objectives, right? Nuclear weapons, fantastic for saying, like, I really care about this and I'm willing to bet everything on it. Right. Okay. It's not just that I'm, mutually assured destruction wasn't just about preventing World War III. It was like preventing World War III and trying to ensure that your valuable interests, right, your vital interests were not compromised. Okay. You can win the war with multi-domain forces, right? Cyber, we all know, is fantastic because it's low cost, it's cheap, there's all kinds of things you can do with it. But maybe you want to actually just, right, spend more time hanging out at The Hague and learning about how important kind of, international coordination, trade, and law might be in order to come up with more win-win situations that can accommodate, actors and get us, less likely to engage in military action in the first place. Okay.
Jon?
So all of those things are relevant. I think Erik wants to jump in here.
Sure. I just I apologize for that. I think so one of our insights from our cross multi-domain stuff is that power in abstract is fungible and is usually treated that way in our theories, but in practice it has to take a concrete form, which is usually not fungible. And the classic not fungible capability is nuclear weapons. Give me better terms of trade or I'll nuke you is not really a very effective strategy for winning in political affairs in our world. But in other settings, nuclear weapons can be arguably very consequential. So once you actually take your defense budget and buy stuff and deploy forces, you heighten certain qualities or capabilities and you compromise, you don't have others. And that's going to impact the flavor of deterrence that you get because of these different elements, because deterrence isn't an it, but a they, a bundle of different qualities, all of which decision makers would love to have, but they can't have equally. And in part, based on what they buy, they get these qualities. If Putin had a pawn shop, he probably would love to turn in a couple of submarines right now for a few more armored brigades, but he can't really do that. He's already spent the money, right? And so both in coercive terms and in deterrence terms, you pre-commit yourself to some degree to some of these qualities to emphasize them more than others. And that's part of the defense planning process, but it also creates vulnerabilities for different societies. Building a big navy may have been a smart thing, or maintaining a big navy may have been a smart thing for the Russians, but it also has a consequence in terms of the war that they actually end up fighting.
Great. Thank you, Erik. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. It's an eye chart. I just put it up there to kind of say, hey, there's theory in this book, but we also marshal a lot of evidence, both kind of quantitative and qualitative. And it going through all of these different domains, different kinds of specialized military equipment, and then looking at its impact on the risk of war. Right. So, for example, we look at naval forces, and navies think that navies are great for deterrence, showing the flag. And what they're actually useful for is influence, right? You can go to a lot of places. Okay, so you can project power, but there is a deterrence liability because the very advantage that you have in navies, right? They can go anywhere, right? They can bring a lot of firepower. You can cheaply spread influence around the entire globe, anywhere that there's an ocean, right? That's also a liability, right? Because the other side has to wonder, are you actually going to show up and make good on your commitments? If you have showed up, are you going to stay there? Or are you going to redeploy your expensive, vulnerable naval vessels elsewhere? So we find that states that have more comparative naval power tend to have more influence. They have their disputes further away, but they have more of them, right? So this is just kind of a characteristic of a means that is very useful for, influence and war fighting, right? But then has these liabilities in terms of stability. Okay, and we could tell similar stories with a lot of the other domains there. If you want to go into one in the Q&A, we could, but that would take us, this would be a much longer seminar. Okay, so kind of starting to wrap up here, right? The reason this matters for kind of the policy debate, and I'm going to kind of put the China version up here. We could talk through the Russian one later if you want. Is that a lot of debates that are about deterrence, right? We think are actually about preferences, right? And China is a great example right now. So, I mean, the United States is kind of all in on deterrence. You won't find any pundit or policymaker that thinks deterrence is a bad idea, right? So kind of universal consensus that we need to deter China. And yet we have this huge debate about should we do it by having, a big fancy forward kind of naval posture that has lots of drones and automated, capabilities and is like highly, highly lethal. Or should we be reassuring our allies by putting more troops into Japan and South Korea, right? Should we have a more formal guarantee to Taiwan? Okay. Should we help these states kind of just defend themselves by making them, a impenetrable hedgehog or porcupine? Okay. All of these things are interesting possibilities, right? But they're actually kind of looking at these different strategies that we talked about, right? Some are emphasizing coercion, some are more about war fighting, some are about like relying on, cyber and kind of more cheaper means. We would even put naval forces in this category, right? When you say I want to do offshore balancing, you're saying I don't want to spend the money on forward deployed forces because I think that that's too expensive. I'd rather have this mobile naval force that can respond when I need it. Okay. Or, right, Charlie Glazer, right, says that, hey, we should just cut a deal and basically cede influence over Taiwan to China because that would reduce the risk of a catastrophic global war. Okay. So a more kind of accommodation, approach. He calls it a grand bargain. Okay. So we've got all of these different strategies, right? And they're about parts of deterrence. And that's why they can vigorously say, hey, this is the best way to deter China. An argument is like, well, deterrence is many things. So what do you actually want, right? Do you want to reduce your defense outlays? Do you want to reduce the cost of deterrence? Do you want to ensure that you have lots and lots of influence over where and how, China is going to act in the East and South China Seas? Like those are different stories, and you're going to have different strategies that will accompany them. Okay. So just wrapping up here, right? Erik already said it. You can't always get what you want, right? To quote the Rolling Stones, right? It's really, really attractive and alluring to think that deterrence is going to be the silver bullet that will solve our grand strategic problems, if only we can get all of the services and the different parts of the U.S. government and all of the allies working together. Okay, so a whole of government, a whole of coalition, integrated solution. Okay, so, in the 2022 U.S. National Security Strategy, and this is being pushed in NATO as well, right? There's this idea that integrated deterrence across all domains, across the entire spectrum of conflict, from gray zone to nuclear war, across all allies and partners, right? Everybody will be putting together a common strategy. Our question is like, putting aside the heinous kind of political, and bureaucratic difficulties of doing that, it actually may not be possible in principle once you recognize that deterrence is multiple things. And those different parts of deterrence that you have are actually optimized for these different strategies, right? So if you're building up a really robust force for warfighting, and yet it depends on a lot of mobility and stealth and exquisite space and cyber capabilities, that's fantastic for power. not so fantastic for clear and credible signaling because you can't advertise how it actually works. So these trade-offs are kind of built into the problem, and it really comes down to kind of the classic, political questions of what do you really, really want, right? So you need to kind of make decisions. So that would wrap it up. I would say you can't always get what you want, but you can definitely get what you need, right, at Oxford for only $34.95. Anyway, thanks very much, and look forward to any of your questions.